So, thank you, Simon, for inviting me, first of all. I'm really pleased to be here and to be involved in furthering the study of curation and looking at curation in a more nuanced way that actually deals with society as it exists and barriers that we know are there to making these spaces really exclusive and not suited to everyone. So that's generally my passion, is to try and make these spaces that aren't excluding. With that in mind, I'm going to be talking about curating pain and curating exclusion and discrimination. So I speak about exclusion and discrimination specifically because I think it's something that's present in every exhibition that's ever curated. And if it's not there, people aren't asking the critical questions of who's not in the room, whose perspective is being pushed forward, and what kind of message is being passed about ideas of goodness and beauty, fundamentally. So I like to challenge this by interrogating the idea of safe spaces. Safe spaces are something in museums that a lot of people believe they can create. They can create a space where differences can be celebrated and critique can be made, and universities are supposed to be a safe space. I'm not sure I believe in them, so that's why I like to interrogate it as a concept, because I think safe spaces really depend on neutrality and how far people are allowed to dissent in these spaces realistically against whoever holds the authority for making that space safe. And then I am a big advocate for valuing different forms of knowledge, so taking people's lived experiences, their work experience, and academic experience, and actually weighting that equally to shift the power dynamic, to make sure that that's weighted equally, because while a lot of people say that we should do that, systems are set up to kind of not allow that, in which, for example, people who are brought on board for the experience they bring from their lived experience are often not paid, or if they're paid an honorarium, or if they're invited half the compensation. So there's a lot of things that come in to kind of break the valuing of that, but that these differences of knowledge production actually change what each of us hold as empirical truth. And empirical truth within museums is something that has historically been valued very highly alongside this idea of neutrality. And then I want to challenge the idea of hidden histories versus whole histories. Basically agency in a lot of these questions. The idea of if you're hiding a story, then the person who's been hidden has very little agency, and that the idea that if they're not present in museum spaces, they're not present at all, and that they haven't just found another space that you're just not aware of. So a lot of museums like to talk about the fact that, we're going to reveal a hidden history. The history's there because we search out the people who have the lived experience or the artistic expression to unpack these stories. But they're doing it not within a museum. It's not that they're hidden, but we're just not including their story or not creating a space that allows for this varied story. And then finally, this idea of multiple voices. This idea of neutrality comes with the idea of authority and the authoritative voice. The authoritative voice tries to be balanced. It tries to take a lot of research and condense it down, curate the information that we've accessed through our research and through our interaction with objects to something that feels balanced, feels defensible, and feels kind of authoritative. But it makes it seem as if there's one homogenous voice, and gets rid of the idea that most museum exhibitions have been authored by multiple people throughout the whole process, whether it's the director who's decided what the exhibition title is going to be, or if it's the person in engagement who's worked with somebody who came up with the title. Basically, lots of voices, lots of hands go into exhibitions. We like to pretend that there's only one. So collaborative practices, at least in that form, being open about being collaborative with people who don't necessarily work with museums, allow spaces for these multiple voices to be present and to experiment. My practice is very experimental. To experiment with how to place those voices in the space and whether or not audiences can handle basically having multiple voices rather than one authoritative balanced voice, as has been the practice in the past. Spoiler alert, they can. People, museum visitors aren't really stupid. They can actually read multiple perspectives and find their own voice if they choose. Because a lot of statistics show they don't read anything. So it's all moot at some point. So I'm going to do this interrogate these points by talking about these two case studies, as Simon said, passes now and within and without. I use those as shorthands because it's a very long title, so both exhibitions. Both of them were at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. Now, the premise for doing this was that Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery is actually supposed to close for essential redevelopment. Basically, the pipes and the electricity are falling apart. It's a museum that was built in the 1900s. The newest bits were built in 1914, and the oldest bits in 1885. And it's kind of crumbling. So the council has to close it to fix that. And the museum decided that it should be an opportunity to redevelop the storylines. Since Birmingham museum was opened, the city itself has become what is known as super diverse. Meaning that by the next census, it's expected to be one of the majority cities in the country, because the people who will come of age are all BME. Not really all, but it's going to become more than 50%. So the museum knows that it caters for a pretty diverse visitor movement, and it tells a story that is not only exclusive but also quite painful in some respects to the visitors it needs to work for to survive in the future. So the idea is that the museum is going to change, and all of the stories are going to be retold and redesigned in a way that is more engaging, cross-disciplinary, so they want to kind of break the mold that this is art history, this is science, and kind of use the fact that the collections are all very diverse in terms of what they can talk about, to use it to tell stories rather than to tell just like a canon of art. And so to do that, they put aside a gallery in the current museum that they've labeled the Story Lab Gallery. Within this space, they want to test some permanent storylines, the ones that they think are most in need of deep consultation before they can put them in a permanent space. So they'd actually put aside 3 storylines, one of which hasn't been seen, but the museum isn't actually closing. Again, it's been delayed for 2 more years, so maybe they'll reintroduce the 3rd one that they dropped out. First one was the British Empire. The second one was body image, and the 3rd one was protests. So within and without, and passes now were for the empire and the body image narratives. So the idea of the space was, because it's to be part of the permanent display eventually, it's supposed to feel like a lab. People are supposed to write down comments on whiteboards and pieces of paper and feed back into how the new ways that we're trying to tell the story are coming across, but also the different techniques we're using to tell the story. So within and without was much more experimental in terms of breaking the mold, whereas the past is now is much more about challenging the tone and exploring how far we can push subjectivity in the museum space, primarily. That wasn't necessarily the aim in the beginning, but it ended up being one of the main aims in the end. So that was the context for Birmingham, but beyond that, there was these sort of collaborative works. They have a larger context that we're all aware of. So I put what's happening now, which is really just kind of like when you do this sort of work. So temporary exhibitions have a lot more room for being experimental because they can be really reactive to current pop culture and to politics as it happens. Whereas permanent galleries, if you do that, you tend to, I'm so sorry, I keep breathing into that mic. They tend to come across really dated very quickly. So you'll see that in some museums that opened a permanent gallery that was like state of the art in 2000, and now they're making dated references, and the technology they've used is really out of date as well. So in permanent galleries, you don't tend to do that, but it's still important to note that these things affect how the exhibition is formed. So for us, it's obviously the politics of Brexit and Trump came into to play. We had pop culture references after the exhibition. The Past Now came up was a Black Panther movie, but definitely kind of played into how the exhibition was received. The museum itself is located in what is called Chamberlain Square. Now, Joseph Chamberlain was colonial secretary. He was a big imperialist, and then he actually laid the foundation stone for the museum. So that ended up becoming one of the key stories we want to interrogate when we talked about the British Empire in a very Birmingham context, because he's extraordinarily celebrated. The university has whole buildings named after him, and basically state that they still follow the ethos that Joseph Chamberlain laid out for them. Now, Birmingham is also a place of dissent. People come together from different points of view and have a lot of clashes. So the picture there is of an EDL march in 2017. It was also the site for the Rivers of Blood speech in Powell. So it has a history of kind of facing these troubled histories and making its mark nationally for meeting of dissenting voices. And then finally, the museum actually has a very long history of collaborative work. They have a permanent gallery that is entirely collaboratively curated on faith in Birmingham. At the same time as Passes Now, there was a collaboratively curated exhibition called Nights of Abroad, in which the model was totally different in that the museum kind of played merely a facilitating role in putting on that exhibition, but it was led by an artist who brought the story, did the research, and really owned the exhibition. So while our exhibition, and I'll get into it, had some problems in its process, it was also experienced alongside this other exhibition that had a very different process and was really well received. So that's the kind of context of the when and the where. So we had our institutional history and our institutional memory. And then the stakeholders. So the stakeholders are the directors, they're the public, they're the people who pay the money, and they're the people who are involved in actually doing the work, which people often forget are stakeholders. So there's a lot of power in the person who does the research, whether or not they want to push forward certain ideas or certain information. So that was my position. I actually came into the project as a research assistant. It was quite a difficult project, and in the end I ended up becoming the curator for various reasons, which I might go into, but I might just leave that as a tantalizing bit of gossip. So I start from this idea that museums are many things to many people. They're both a site for remembering and for forgetting. They're spaces that we allocate for recording and displaying history, but many people find that history incomplete and as a site of purposeful romanticism and forgetfulness and active silencing of voices that don't match the romantic view. They are, to many people, a space for critical engagement with what you are viewing, but to a lot of other people, they're places for entertainment. Sometimes they're just a place to go to the bathroom. Sometimes it's a place where the only place you can take your children where they're not going to kill you or you kill them. Sorry about this. Can you still hear me if I step back this far? Oh, okay, fine. That's better for everybody. There are also spaces for nationalist propaganda. This is again with this romantic idea, but a lot of my research kind of comes down to the idea that museums play into nationalism, and we are reacting to nationalist ideals of the past that have affected the way that we have history to manage today, and that they are affected by our versions of nationalism or patriotism in the present, which sometimes don't match the past. Particularly comes out with decolonizing. But for many, they're also a place for social change. So I'm also a board member for Museum Association, and they talk relentlessly about the fact that museums change lives. There's a lot of research to show that museums are really good for mental health. They're very good for engaging with something that you might have forgotten, so remembrance, etc. And then more and more they're being asked to join in political debates. They're asked to be agents for inclusivity in an increasingly divisive society. So with all of these as the realities that multiple people experience of singular spaces, it's quite interesting to mediate that and to collaboratively curate that. So this was a quote that we had on the wall for the Passes Now, and it was kind of placed there to challenge us, to take something that was temporary and to make permanent change with it, to kind of prove Audre Lorde wrong, and to say, maybe a museum can be decolonized. I don't know if it can. So the Passes Now, I'll start with that as a case study, was primarily an experiment in decolonizing museum curation. And I'm very, I'm very open about the fact that I don't think that the that question was answered, if museums can be decolonized. Sumaya Kasim, who was one of our co-curators, she definitely thinks museums can't be decolonized. And she wrote this paper, if you haven't read it yet, for Media Diversified, in which she kind of talks about the process of putting on this exhibition and why it led to her skepticism. But to kind of attempt this idea of decolonizing museum practice, we wanted to try a democratized working model. We wanted to work with people who were also not necessarily already stakeholders of museums. So a lot of times collaborative projects work with existing volunteers who have a stake in the museum. They generally have goodwill. They come as visitors, and they've been happy about what happened. So they're not really looking to burn it to the ground. Whereas we're working with activists who are self-identified activists who had all previously been very disappointed with museums as a whole, and our museum very specifically. And they were particularly upset about the representation of the British Empire and what was perceived as colonial celebration. So we worked with them, so there were 6 activists, and there were then 15 people in total. So 6 of them were activists, 11 were museum staff, and 2 of the museum staff were freelancers. So I myself was a freelancer, and I only speak as a freelancer and not as a representative of Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. Camera. I came in externally halfway through the project. And my role was to be a researcher for the co-curators, not necessarily for Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, to bridge the gap between having the knowledge to use the systems that museums have in place and the will to break that system so that it worked for people who had a different agenda. So I came in and I worked with the co-curators for 7 of the 8 sessions, and there were only supposed to be 5 sessions. I normally describe the process of making decisions as tense and made over these 8 sessions alongside some very terse email conversations, which is brushing over a lot of the detail, which I am going to go into in a little bit. What's key about this is that the exhibition is very well received, particularly in the museum world. It has been, the process of doing it has been used as a really interesting kind of practical exploration of what happens when you implement decolonial theory. But it is only part of the outcome. So we won't know if it was successful in any of its kind of overarching aims to create permanent change until we see the legacy, until the museum reopens and we see what they did with the permanent galleries, until the staff turn over, and if the staff who remain have the same kind of buy-in to this ethos of decolonizing. So it's important to say that the 10-year plan has now said that the museum is going to decolonize itself, which is great. Whether or not they understand what that means is another thing. So we made a mistake on this project of not defining decolonizing. So decolonizing is really interesting. There's a lot of academic theory behind it. There's a lot about political decolonizing. But what we didn't do was talk about how it would be enacted in a museum over a short period of time. So, and who decolonizes as well is a big question. Was it that we were inviting the external co-curators to decolonize the museum, or were we all going to be agents that decolonize the museum? And what version of decolonizing we were enacting? So what happened was that the co-curators had an idea that it would basically be decentralizing whiteness, which is core to decolonizing concepts. But what the museum really wanted was to put itself in the story and to unpack where it had been historically misbehaving. And that was important because we wanted to say why we were there, like why was this happening in the museum rather than anywhere else. So we wanted to say, we are a big colonial structure, let's unpack that, let's unpack what lessons we learned through colonizing and being agents of the empire to redisplay that and say kind of we have not necessarily been following best practice for everybody. Just thinking about my processes. Let me just go through here first. So the process went on from June to October. which is a very short time to conduct all the researching, to choose the objects, to choose the narrative, to co-write the interpretation for 8 major stories, 62 objects, and to design the space. So that's the 3D design and the 2D design, and then to edit all that writing, edit the curatorial choices, and then install and open. So one of the main problems was we did not have a realistic timeline for this project, so we compressed a lot of decision making, which created a lot of tensions. But what we did do is we changed the tone. So you'll see what you would see if the exhibition was still on, would be our form of decolonizing in terms of the tone of voice and that we presented. So we were very clear that museums were not neutral, and that this complex story had to be told, couldn't be told neutrally. And then we explained that the gallery had been co-curated. But nowhere else in the gallery do we say that this isn't the museum's voice. Everything there, therefore, is with this new perspective, but so we're maintaining this idea of authority in museum spaces. We also wanted to kind of just give a brief overview of the British Empire in terms of its scale, but we really didn't want to hammer in on kind of a long history of chronology of the British Empire, because this room was too small to give kind of an encyclopedic exhibition. We were only going to be telling stories. And we wanted to start at a higher level. We didn't want to say, hey, there was a British Empire. We kind of wanted to assume knowledge on the part of the visitor, which is something that museum practice tells you not to do, because the gallery, for this exhibition particularly, was aimed at young BME audiences under the age of 40. And we assumed that they knew what the British Empire was, because normally it was the reason why they were here. So we also gave some guidance for languages that we were going to use in the gallery so that we were able to get at a higher reading age. So normally museums reduce the reading age down to 12. So if you had been educated to the age of 12, you'd be able to understand everything in the gallery. We elevated that to 16, and that was a very hard-fought battle to say that this is aimed at people with GCSEs. We were told that it would make it really inaccessible, and that besides the contents being inaccessible, if we made more things difficult, it wouldn't necessarily work. It did work. Children were just explained the things that they didn't understand by their guardian who they were with, and the main thing was that there was too much text rather than that the text was too higher reading age. So the stories we actually told in this space, now mind you, this is one room, one square room, was, so at the back wall you can see is a salon hang to talk about representation of people of color in public spaces. So everything on the wall is either by a person of color or of a person of color to kind of ask the question of the difference between self-representation and representation. But we made a point of not choosing anything that was overtly offensive, that most things in there would still be beautiful. If you still wanted to critique why it was beautiful, that would be possible, but we didn't want this to feel like a space that might feel threatening or not have a sense of just beauty about black bodies. And in the center of the museum, in the gallery, was guns in Birmingham. So that was central to the story of Birmingham, because it's part of the reason why the infrastructure of the city was made, was the trade of guns. And in the galleries, the permanent history galleries, it's talked about, but it's kind of said that guns were traded in Birmingham, and doesn't explain that it was as part of the triangular trade initially, and that there were members of the Birmingham public that wrote in against the abolition movement, because if the trade ended, then the economy would collapse. At the gallery entrance, you saw the narrative of eugenics. We wanted to talk about Francis Galton being born in Birmingham and doing much of his initial research at the foundation of eugenics in Birmingham. He would literally stand on the street corner and click a button when he saw an attractive woman. And then he did this across England to create a map of attractiveness per city, alongside some many worse stories of eugenics, obviously. And we wanted to interrogate anthropology within that space of the practice of eugenics and of creating hierarchies of people and cultures. So we talked about this artwork by Margaret Millwald, who was an artist and an anthropologist, and she traveled around India and she cast the faces of people she felt represented the best racial types she encountered. And they were 50 of them, I think. I might be lying, maybe 30. Made up the primary collection for the museum in Calcutta. So we wanted to interrogate what had been previously displayed as beautiful objects, beautiful casts, to celebrate diversity, but actually to discuss the painful history of categorizing people and creating assumptions based on visual attributes about someone else's morality or other things. We then spoke about two independence movements. So this one here is Kenyan independence. And this one was, the artwork was proposed to us by the the contemporary art curator of the museum. And it's by William Gere, and it's called Mau Mau. And William Gere was a really important abstract artist for Birmingham. He wasn't widely celebrated at the time as a contemporary, but has been celebrated in this past. And then everything else we had in the case was objects that had been donated to us by an ex-serviceman, and they had been confiscated by a Mau Mau soldier during the uprising. And we wanted to interrogate here kind of the idea of presenting and only having one perspective. So everything we had in that case was also everything we had in the World Art Collection to talk about the Kikuyu people. We also had the archives from the original curator saying that the knives, which are on display here, were bloodstained and deemed amusing additions to the specialist African collection. So we wanted to ask the question, can things that were collected during colonial period ever be used to use a balanced argument? We left that as a question against the case. And actually it was really interesting because I had a personal fight with a visitor over this case where she said that I was taking one person's perspective and blowing it up to make it seem like it was representative of the nation. And I basically said that's what museums do. I'm just doing a different perspective than normally is, which is interesting if you want to kind of engage in an argument. We also want to talk about the handmade gun in the center as an example of war weapons that don't have a industrial backing. We aren't able to make guns like they were in Birmingham for this purpose. What happens when two sides are differently armed? We also talked about capitalism, which isn't pictured here, which is hilarious because that was the area that we had the most complaints from public. We talked about capitalism and how it's portrayed versus what the actual cost of manufacturing is. We had a lot of legal worries about that case because we wanted to interrogate Cadbury's, but Cadbury still exists. So we didn't really interrogate Cadbury's. We put a lot of Cadbury's things in there, and then we asked questions around it, asking the visitor to draw their own conclusions. And then we talked about the environmental impact of capitalist endeavors across the world. We particularly wanted to talk about deforestation and how it affects recovery post-natural disaster, particularly in the Caribbean. Hurricane Maria had just kind of hit, and we wanted to talk about deforestation and the links of mass industrial production through timber in the Caribbean has led to destabilized soil and harder recovery and deeper impact to local sites of disaster. We also talked about Indian independence, but I'm going to talk about that in a little bit as a case study. And then I think that was it. Oh, Joseph Chamberlain. We had a whole case on Joseph Chamberlain in which we interrogated how he was displayed upstairs versus how he was displayed in the gallery itself. Asking kind of what happens when you focus in on him as an imperialist versus him as a local politician, because he's celebrated for creating a lot of the municipal kind of foundations that Birmingham thrives on today. So these were everybody who was kind of involved mostly, and we did a lot of sessions in terms of big meetings. We had the designers come and pitch the designs to the group. We took them to the Museum Collection Center for them to look at objects and artworks. We took them around the gallery as a tour. We had the curators all present their own collection, each collection that they managed in a way that they envisioned it could be decolonized. And we invited them to installation to make decisions about where things were actually placed. The main thing that they were involved in was the story choices and the interpretation for the 8 objects, the 8 storylines overall, and for signing off the final object list for each story. Where we had a lot of tension was in designing the space and interpreting the space. And I had initially put the timeline that we put aside for each of these things, but I think it made me too sad, so I took it off. But we only really had 3 weeks for writing and editing our interpretation, which is far too short. And we had a long lead-in for designing, but it kind of all compressed in the end. I put in this diagram for the idea of participation because I like to ask whether or not they were actually partners or consultants in this. So for this first project, they were all paid a honorarium for their time and their expertise. And in the project after this, they were all volunteers. And I think we were somewhere in the middle between consultation and partnership. So this was the Indian independence case. We actually had a curator who had expertise on this. So we felt pretty solid that we'd be able to interrogate this story quite well. All of the co-curators also had interests in this area. Most of them were of South Asian descent. And it was the 70th anniversary of partition of India. So we wanted to delve into the story. Now this is a very wordy slide. But basically, our co-curator wrote this piece of text first, in the blue. Sorry, I know you guys can't see it when I do that. In this bit. And then we sent the curator in the museum, rewrote it and did this. And then basically this one was sent back to us and told, no, this is what we meant. Don't rearrange it to create different agency and to kind of gloss over some of the difficulties. And then in the end, that's where we ended. So it was longer than we wanted it to be, and it largely followed most of the initial display, the initial text. But we had issues with this because what was being projected from their point of view was a nationalist perspective. And for the partition of India, it's a bold move to take a nationalist perspective because it's also still another exclusionary stance. But in the end, we had to make a decision on this about how much we wanted this to be the co-curators' voices versus how much we wanted it to be the museum being able to defend what was being written. And in the end, we decided, so we checked, so they wrote it, most of it, and then we edited to make sure that it made sense. And then we checked it with academics who followed decolonial, who said that they followed decolonial ways of thinking, and then we kind of sent it back to them. We told the academics that they weren't to change the tone or really the content. They were only supposed to kind of fact check things. So our academics really just checked the statistics on this primarily, or called us out when something was basically wildly inaccurate, which was only once or twice. So from the Joseph Chamberlain case, for example, the co-curators called him a racist, and we were like, let's take that out just in case. And then the academic was like, no, he was a racist, put it back in. So it was quite interesting in terms of the back and forth of that process, but that was largely hidden from the co-curators that we were doing this because we were trying to hide the fact that we were nervous about the process. We wanted to show that we were trusting. And in the end, that created a lot of distrust because they knew other things were happening, but they thought that we were just kind of like being this like large museum in the background, kind of swiping through and being like, no, we say no for no reason, because we weren't being open about our version of the workload. And then we had big contentions for the actual graphics, especially the introduction graphic, the past is now. We consulted on this with the most of the internal staff, with the front of house team, and with the co-curators. And the first designs came back and they looked kind of like a school project that was really celebratory of the British Empire. And this kind of made the co-curators quite unhappy because a lot of them had design expertise as well. and felt they could have done that job a lot easier, a lot better, but that they weren't being paid a design fee, they were being paid an honorarium, so they weren't going to even give the detailed critique they could as professionals, but just to say, we are unhappy with this. And then it was kind of down to us to translate just general dissatisfaction back to the designers. And so the spit on the left was actually me basically just ripping it up, because I was like, don't tie it back together, don't make it neat, make it visceral. And in the end, it got to a place that we were generally happy with, which was the final one. But it did bring up a lot of questions about the fact that our design team, who had tendered for this position, were again all white, and it felt from their initial contributions that they didn't understand that we weren't trying to celebrate the empire. They were still kind of in this kind of practice of, if we're talking about the British Empire and we're using the Union Jack, it's going to be positive, and we're really unwilling to disrupt that. And I think it's possibly because we didn't take them on the journey with us, but also because the co-curators didn't recruit them, we recruited them. So there was again this idea that we were creating these structures of power that they couldn't, that they weren't involved in. I'm going to have to rush through because I've spent a lot of time on the past now because it's really rich and interesting. We had a lot of social media, and there was a lot of things going on at the time that fed back into how it was being received. And these were kind of the lessons that I learned and that I normally tell other museum professionals about. So it's going to be read very much like to museum professionals because it's copied and pasted from all my slides. But basically, it's the idea that you have to be responsive to the content of the work, and that decolonizing, which has become in the museum sector a buzzword for that gets you funding, that it's not actually something you can tick off, that it is something that requires a lot of work, that it's actually an action that you improve on and you get better, and that you need to bind to it internally. It has to be self-motivated. Otherwise, if you're engaging with it, you're probably not going to engage with it deeply. And that actually to engage with decolonizing as a museum professional, you need to have self-reflection because you're going to have an existential crisis. You're going to be like, why am I here? Why are museums here? And that there's an idea about museums creating, being benefactors, and that the people that we work with being beneficiaries, and that they should be our friends or be loyal to us, and kind of to make sure that anyone engaging with this process doesn't believe that the people that they're working with are going to be loyal to them. And to address their individual subjectivities and reactive behavior and fragilities. To define the language that you use, because it creates a sense of expectation management, and to be prepared for conflict, and to notice that erasure is embedded and it's everywhere. So, on to the next project, which I have 6 minutes to talk about, so speeding up. We were looking at absence. We were looking at how you create collectively absence, and we wanted to do that by talking about body image. So one of the ways we want to do this, we want to use this space as a chance to put in multiple ways of interpreting objects and a gallery narrative. And so this gallery actually had, let me count quickly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ways of experiencing the space. So this wall that you see here was what we pitched to our collaborators as manual VR, in that we wanted to give the visitor something that they could touch, and to give them an introduction that was visceral to the perspective that they wanted to follow throughout the gallery. So you picked up a clipboard and it would say something like, I don't want to use their real names, and I don't want to slip and use a real name. Thomas is fat, and he feels very self-conscious about being fat. You need to get naked to get into his body, his idea of his body image, look at yourself, and then go around the space, or something like that. And sometimes I pick a music, sometimes I pick smells in the description, and you could touch these objects that they associated with themselves. Ironically, the one that was for this person feeling fat was this Ken doll, because it's the largest Ken doll you can get, and he's called Buff Ken, and he's still really tiny. And then each of these had a trail that went through 5 key objects in the museum, in the gallery space, and you went through and listened to the interpretation in the voice of the person who had done the interpreting. We then had academic labels written by me, We had story labels, so we had someone wrote a story and put it in a storybook, and you picked objects and you followed that story around. We had individual labels, which were personal reflections on the objects by our different collaborators. And then we had a standard museum label, except that we inverted the why was this here and put that primarily there at the top, so why it was chosen, and then added in kind of what some basic facts about the object might be, or artwork. And again, this is a cross-disciplinary display. It had artworks, it had social history objects, it had anthropological pieces to kind of interrogate this story. So that was the intro text, and I can show it later if you want, but it was basically asking questions of the visitor and saying that we were looking at absence, but we wanted to be hopeful. We wanted to say that just because something wasn't here doesn't mean it didn't exist, and that this is a space to kind of to challenge and to be critical. We wanted to express that very clearly. For both of the exhibitions, while we decided we couldn't necessarily create a space that was safe for everybody, we could lay out the foundations of how we wanted the space to be interrogated that followed the ethoses that was created through the collaboration process. We also talked about, within the space, kind of the life's journey. So we had life and death, and we had childhood. And then we had the male gaze as one of the narratives to explore why there might be absence and whom things were created for initially in like pop culture and art. We wanted to talk about colorism. This was highlighted as a very key story for Birmingham. And we wanted to talk about queering as an adjective and an action, and looking through our historical collection to kind of challenge heteronormativity. As you can see, I got away with trying to get through some more complex ideas in exhibitions, and it worked very well. But it was entirely collaboratively curated. So in this one, we had a core team of collaborators. So there were 10 collaborators who worked weekly with us after work to decide the content of the exhibition. They were to choose the core objects and the storyline that we wanted to tell, and they also helped to write the intro text. And then we worked with LGBTQ refugee group, with a U3A group, so that's students over 50, and we worked with a school, Lord's Wood all-girls school, to choose other objects and to write interpretation within the gallery. In this process, they also designed the layout of the space, so we created a scaled-down version of the gallery out of Lego and had scaled images of the objects, and we walked around, we placed them, and we talked about visually what happens when you place things next to each other. Besides the text and interpretation, actually, if people aren't reading anything, what are they going to see? What are they going to get from the placement of these objects? So that felt richer. It felt like there was a lot more choice in terms of the curation than the first project, which focused a lot more on the text. This focused a lot more on the other aspects of interpretation to me. And we gave them kind of the options to vote. So we left it really open, and I'll show you some of the slides in a bit that we presented to them. But we then realized it was far too open, and we were the professionals in the room. We were the ones being paid. And so after all the discussions, we kind of created what we thought were options based on the collaborative discussions that we could vote on to lead the exhibition forward with. So we then presented them with this. We each kind of presented each of the stories individually and gave them comment cards about how they wanted to edit it further. So they selected the first one, but they said they wanted this object in there. And actually, everything that was presented here ended up being in the exhibition, all the objects, but that the choice was allowed us to focus in on individual narratives. So we were really keen in this one to explore ethically collaborating, because we felt that that was where the tensions really occurred in the last project. It was far too short timeline, and we hadn't really thought about what might occur in terms of power dynamics of collaboration. So that was really at the heart of this process, was making sure that the content was good, but that wasn't the key factor. So for the Hasses now, we're really aware that if we were going to attempt an exhibition that was about the British Empire from the perspective of the colonized and co-curated with women of color, that the outcome couldn't be bad. The outcome had to still be good, of high quality, so that it could have the impact it has had. But because we had this drive for quality, the process was more difficult. So for this one, we tried to focus on the process and hoped that the quality would come out of ethical collaboration. And we wanted to put the multiple perspectives in the space and test how well they were received. So this is how we proposed it to the collaborators. We were really keen and clear about what the Birmingham Museum Gallery vision was, that we were trying to make something accessible and inclusive, And that it was that we did have the larger aim that it would be permanent, and that we needed to make sure that it could translate to something permanent, and that we wanted to focus on this idea of stories. And we laid out this process of collaboration, including starting with terms of engagement, so that they knew how we were defining all of our terms, how we were defining the collaborative process, including defining how we chose to use the word democracy. Democracy in our sessions meant that we would all try to make a decision as a group, but if the time ended and there was no decision made, the group allowed the paid staff to make the final decision, trusting that we were going to follow their ethos and we didn't have another agenda. And we kind of went through the idea to make sure that everything was beneficial, so we gave them sessions on how to tell a story. We had like theater performers come in, talk about different ways of interpreting objects. Rather than saying break the mold, we showed different molds that could be used to and incorporated. And we helped them to do object shortlists. We had an object handling session at the MCC again, which is the Museum Collection Center. And then we looked at what was next and asked if they wanted to stay involved afterwards, which is how some of them came to be involved in the actual placement of the objects in the space. And we were clear that this is the outcome only, and that we were making these decisions with values in mind, and that we were also working with other people, and that there were other stakeholders involved. And then this was kind of, we were very clear that we were going to withhold editorial powers, and that we felt that we should execute a duty of care over how the volunteers were treated. Because again, they were volunteers. There's a lot more laws around working with volunteers versus working with people who are paid an honorarium. So we had to basically subscribe to following a lot of that. So the lessons that we learned from that one was to make sure that we weren't really putting too much intellectual labor on the collaborators this time around. That as volunteers, we had a role of kind of being the people with the expertise and kind of placing ourselves back in that room. Not to say that the external collaborators were going to do the exhibition for us, but to say that they were bringing X in form of knowledge production, we were bringing Y, and that they were going to be equally valued, and that because we came with intellectual research and the facilities to conduct that research, that we were going to have to do a lot more of that legwork. So we presented these themes and ideas that we wanted to unpack based on the things that they were generating anyways. That we actually found that though we created too safe a space and there really wasn't that much dissent in that. So talking about something quite difficult as your body image and being excluded from representation, we kind of expected a lot more difficult conversations. But they didn't really occur. They were kind of touched upon, and then basically wellness kicked in as the overarching theme rather than taking apart something difficult and making it into an exhibition. We said if you were affected by anything, you could just leave, and that would be a part of the process, that you didn't have to be involved in that discussion if you didn't want to. And we created a lot of flexibility in the design process so that we could respond to changes in the collaborative process, because it's really important to do so. But sometimes that came across as a little bit unprofessional and that we were unprepared, even though it was a part of how we wanted to do collaboration. There were expectations that if you're an institution, that you are better prepared. But again, time came to be a big problem with this. This one had a lot longer timeline, and yet we still didn't have time to implement all the ideas. We needed more time programming, and we needed further buy-in from the higher-ups. So we did have buy-in from the director. The director kind of signed off everything that went forward, but it was difficult to kind of, in the middle, to push through any change. So overall, when it comes to kind of curating difficult histories or doing collaborative curation, thing that I've kind of come to find are these main ideas, is that the curator isn't an ultimate authority, as has been practiced in the past. In collaborative curation, you have to kind of look to other disciplines, particularly front of house, who are the people who actually experience how visitors interact with the space. But also look outside of the museum and look at other industries, because museums are very slow. And so to do this kind of work, we need to be faster, we need to be more reactive, and that involves looking at other disciplines and deciding how much we need the objects, or how precious we feel we need to be about the objects. And then museums are an easy target, so they're risk averse. They're really visible. They're home to a lot of people who see it as a space for patriotism, nationalism, and just a comfortable day out. And so change is often very criticized. We had like a Times article against us in the past now, but also we had a lot of people internally basically saying they had lost trust in us for changing the way that they had seen museums to be, but that we need to make a business case for this. There needs to be a business case for diversity. There is a business case for diversity. We just need to follow it. And actually, the Arts Council has put it at the heart of any funding projects now, so it should hopefully get pushed through that way. And that the context of our work for the visitors isn't going to just be our space. It's going to be everything else. It's going to be what's going on in the media, what's going on in politics, but also the other galleries in the permanent space. So, yeah, thanks. I'm going to stop now.
So, thanks very much. This was very interesting. I really enjoyed the way that you discussed some of the problems around policy and practice. Also in terms of collaboration, the idea of how do you work with communities, how do you represent communities, some of the, I think, unanswerable questions that museums have. I would like to start with one thing that you posed as a question that you said maybe it can't be answered, and at the same time you said that one of your colleagues had answered this question, which was, can the museum be decolonized? Which I think is probably on a lot of people's minds. We could also expand that question and say, can the university be decolonized? But it's not, maybe I won't ask you to say yes or no, but rather, how could one answer this question? Both in terms of maybe theoretical reflection, but also in terms of practice, the way in which one works. So that would be hopefully what's behind this double of curating difference, but also curating differently. So I'm wondering if you have some ideas about how could we possibly begin to answer this question?
So what has come up when I asked this question or posed this question before has been that there isn't a pre-colonial museum, that to decolonize something that has never been pre-colonial is difficult. So it's going to be something different, not necessarily something decolonized. So I think it's much more productive to think about change in practice with decolonial ethos, because I'm an advocate for it because it's intersectional. It asks questions about gender and race and sexuality. It talks about faith. It talks about a lot of intersections of identity and how we have created the idea of normality, neutrality that's centered around whiteness. So the main way to decolonize is to break this centralizing and this kind of point of reference. So I find that with anthropology a lot. I kind of talk about the reason I got into this sort of practice was that I'm an artist, and my art practice was very much self-indulgent. It was looking at my identity and trying to figure out, as mixed race, immigrant, how did I fit into the places in which I existed. And I really focused in on museums and institutions and education because that's where I felt the exclusion more generally, because if I was ever represented, which is rarely, like you rarely see mixed race stories. You rarely see a lot of stories. I'm not special in my exclusion, but if I did see a mixed race narrative, it was only ever kind of brought back to whiteness, and it was quite interesting to never have so in anthropology, I feel like the study is about the cultures of the world to help understand us. How we live today. But the we is perceived as we, white British. And so whenever I was encountered, it was as like a point of reference rather than somebody that was invited into the narrative of finding your identity in that space. And to me, museums and universities can follow decolonial principle by not doing that, by simply saying it's not about coming back to perceived as authentic and whatever that authenticity is. So if that's authentically, African or authentically British, authentic is another way of neutral. So yeah, I think it's just kind of breaking away from this idea of like bouncing back and actually talking about the stories we encounter and actually how the individuals in that grow and change from that rather than how they were observed.
So maybe in terms of the two case studies, these two exhibitions, now I know you said that there was more time to do the second one, but if we disregard the temporal aspect just for a minute, in terms of deconstructing, decentering the hegemony of whiteness, which topic do you think was best suited to do that? The British Empire or the image of the body?
The body image, definitely. I think British Empire was important because it's been done quite badly historically, but slightly lazy choice for decolonizing because it allows you to fall back into a lot of tropes that are used to tell these stories, like chronological and focusing on kind of complexities and what were the benefits of the empire rather than thinking about the ideas and the ideologies at play. You think about the historical moments. So I felt body image as a theme was better rather than an event for me.
Okay, there are many other things I could think about asking, but perhaps there are questions that already relates to this central idea of whether it's possible to answer the question of whether we can decolonize the museum. So, anybody has questions or any other questions?
Hi, I had a question regarding sort of museums and their devices for business and revenue, and sort of I feel in some way that the decolonizing has become a sort of strategy to kind of that the museum has absorbed in some places, and it's turned it into a business model that takes the right indicators for funding. So you would have museums that would have a kind of a decolonizing sort of exhibition, you know, yet they're being funded by business models or businesses that are kind of still colonizing, you know, countries in Africa, things like Unilever or things like that. So I'm wondering if this question is already being kind of, you know, the machine has already absorbed it, and the museum is the last place that we can kind of access or kind of form or disseminate this knowledge. Yeah, it's a comment. I mean, it's just to open a question on the difficulty I have on with this subject.
I mean, the business model aspect of museums is something that causes a lot of people a lot of grief. Because ideologically, they want it to be free for everybody. But then, well, a lot of people who are involved in it, those people aren't involved in development and marketing, though, generally. Sorry if anybody is here. And actually, the idea of being like a robust model for survival is really important because there's less and less government funding. And so museums have to look to where they can get the money to keep it free to access. Because obviously the other point would just be to charge people to come in, because then that would be the business model that would pay for itself. And then you do the other things to kind of maintain the costs. So like the costs include like, you know, heating the building, which is insanely boring, but for temperature controlled and climate controlled buildings, it's so expensive. So like for a museum that closes, it costs almost the same for the museum to be closed as it does to be open because of the maintenance of the space itself. So the idea of money and how we fund this whole project is huge. And then if you add in decolonial theory, which kind of puts a lot of barriers to most revenue generating ideas, it's really difficult. So that is something that will be fundamentally almost impossible to overcome in the museum space if we hold on to the idea that museums need to be a part of these buildings and need to be about the objects. I think we'll never decolonize it, financially at least. I'm not this pessimistic though, generally. Did you want to respond?
No.
Hi. Maybe I missed it, but the objects on display, are they all part of the collection? I was wondering how limiting is it to have to work with this collection which is formed in a colonial narrative? Because there's not, I feel like the objects that are outside of the narrative which should be benefiting the white colonial discourse that was the goal at the time are absent. So how do you incorporate the stories that you want to tell when the objects are not there?
We relied very heavily on contemporary art, particularly art that was created through the Black Arts Group, because they were founded in the Midlands, so the museum had a very strong collection to articulate some of these things. We also interrogated some of the really boring things that, if you reframed them, you could look at whose perspective wasn't present. So one of the most successful objects in the Past Is Now was a bicycle that was made in Birmingham. Hercules bicycles. We talked about the fact that the bicycles were really important social history objects in terms of for women's rights and creating access to different areas. We didn't put in a label, but also it stopped a lot of inbreeding because people could leave the village that they were in easier to meet new people. But also we talked about the materiality of asphalt and rubber and how those came to be on this object that was made in Birmingham and where they came from and what was the human cost, as well as the fact that the tubing to make the bicycle was actually a technological advancement of the gun barrel that was again made in Birmingham. So this very seemingly and very positive social history object, and what's used quite a lot now for environmental benefits, actually has a long history in terms of environmental impact and human costs, as well as links to violent objects. So we tried to do that. We tried to take things that might not necessarily be framed in a typical way that were collected through colonial period to kind of celebrate and actually just ask about multiple perspectives to try and reveal what was absent.
I know there's another question. I'll just follow up on this. So, did the question of provenance and whom these objects belong to come into your research?
So I think in the Past Is Now we had the Kikiyu objects, and then we had the objects that were in the Indian independence narrative. And other than that, most of them were made in Birmingham. And with the objects from the Indian independence, we had a lot of provenance information about that. So we explained that, and we used kind of the last Mughal emperor and his poetry to interpret his own hat that we have in the collection, and that sort of thing. For Within or Without, right there is a Kikiyu object, and that was selected by our collaborators, by an all-girls school, and they chose it because form line reminded them of contouring, and they wanted to talk about body image through this idea of perfection that this piece reminded them of. But I felt like in no good conscience could I put a Kikiyu object in a gallery about absence and not talk about cultural and historical erasure. And so that object you'll see has three colors underneath it. So it's white, yellow, burgundy. So the white label just kind of explains the provenance, and we refer to Canada as what is today Canada, not necessarily saying that it is always Canada, always has been, always will be. And then we have the school's interpretation where they talk about form line. And then the academic interpretation kind of calls out the form line aspects and explains what that is culturally, and then talks about historical erasure and the history behind that object. So we try to do that more heavily here with this intersection between personal and academic interpretation.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. I had a question regarding language. If I understand correctly, when you were talking about language, you said that you still wanted to keep a voice of authority. And I was just wondering today, this kind of post-truth, post-factual world, what claim to authority a museum could have, and what claim to truth?
So my fundamental belief is there's no claim to authority or an empirical truth. And for the Past Is Now, the collaborators the co-curators were very keen that the perceived museum authority was in place, but that their authority was put through. And they wanted this because they didn't want this room to feel like an opinion gallery where everything else was still following the idea of authority, and that their words could be deemed as less serious in the context in which they were being presented. And I agreed with that, and we got called out a lot for not being neutral in that space, and we basically responded as a company message from the directors of different collections that we acknowledge museums are not neutral. We're presenting a different perspective than you might be familiar with. Please engage with it. We want to have discussions. This is a starting point for a conversation. And then in the second gallery, we wanted to talk about academic authority as not necessarily like the authority of academia, but the idea of research being played into kind of another form of knowledge production. And we placed lots of different perspectives. So some of the objects had multiple interpretations to kind of show that it can be viewed and seen in multiple ways and have different authorities. But some of them had kind of subscribed a bit more to this idea of a museum having knowledge, which would be interesting because no one really called us upon that or the version of authority we used in that space, even though we were trying to follow the tone of voice that was set in the passes now, actually.
Hiya. I saw the show in Birmingham, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about its relationship and the collaborator's relationship with another show that was happening just a couple of walls over within the same building, and it had my memory's a bit not completely together on it, but it was about in
curry houses in Bangladesh.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about how it goes to run in any sort of parallel, or what kind of conversations the collaborators had about that.
So that project had a longer leading time, so I did mention this is called Nights of the Raj, and that one was it was devised by a local artist whose family history it was relevant to. He basically had been a long-time collaborator with the museum. He had been a co-curator in a number of exhibitions, and I think his relationship with museum staff went back 10 years at that point. So that was a lot deeper in terms of trust and established working models of museums, which can feel really jarring if you're not used to them. But he was also a visual artist, so the exhibition was beautiful. Like, you walked in, had this huge impact. It had a lot of sound. The use of space was really great, and it was really hopeful and interesting, and it felt really comforting as a space to me, not being associated with that history personally, but also to a lot of people who came in who were like, yes, thank you, this is really great to have this in. So that had like a universally loved feeling from our visitors, and actually it won quite a few awards. And when that one was installed, it was installed a few weeks before ours opened. The co-curators suddenly changed their mind as well, and they were like, we want white walls because look how great the white walls look in here. And we're like, we've bought the grey paint, so it's going to be grey now. And they knew each other, so the artist, he works at the same kind of hub, impact hub in Birmingham, where a lot of them now work as freelancers and some of them had worked in before. So they had an established relationship, and they knew each other and aware of each other's kind of ideas. They didn't actually agree on everything, a lot of things actually, but they liked each other's projects and were very respectful of it. Whilst that exhibition was on, our exhibition was received a lot more positively, because it felt like it was the negative aspects of what we were saying were balanced out by the positivity of that space. That space came down before ours did, was replaced by just a fine art display, a contemporary art exhibition, and that's actually when we got a lot of the complaints. And a lot of the feedback from the visitors were about how it was nice to see this huge impact as well of histories that were not centralized in whiteness in close proximity to each other, that took up this really big space and had really big visual impact, and that they were really pleased to have them balance each other and have conversations with each other. So they definitely had our relationship, and I advised the museums to have more of these things, because in that space at one point, so the Past Is Now was on about the British Empire, Nights of the Raj was on, Downstairs was coming out, which was celebrating the partial decolonization of homosexuality, male homosexuality, and then we had the Faith in Birmingham gallery, so we had all of these kind of rich ways of talking about intersectional narratives that then disappeared because all the other things left before the Past Is Now, because that was extended for a few reasons. So we had like a closing exhibition event where we invited an artist to talk about religion and faith and women in that space more. So yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, rambled.
Okay.
Hi. I was just looking at the image that you left up here, and I think I recognise the painting.
Francis Bacon.
Francis Bacon, yeah. I often go to the museum in Birmingham and often see this painting finding its way into lots of the temporary exhibitions. So I was wondering, what was your perspective on this painting being in this exhibition? Why did it appear? And then secondly, do you come under any pressure to put particular works of art into exhibitions from the museum, like celebrated or?
So we don't particularly have any pressure with the Francis Bacon, except that people like it a lot. It had just left kind of the coming out exhibition as well, and went straight into this one. So also the Barbara Walker piece was in the Past Is Now and came back into our exhibition, into Within and Without. And there are a few of these sort of repetitiveness of star objects, which are objects that can articulate a lot of different things, and so a lot of different curators fight for it. So that was kind of what happened there. There was another piece by Julian Waring, which actually was on 3 object lists at the time, and I won because mine was first, but it's going to be taken down. So I had to install it in a way that it could be removed and put in another display without it being too stark an absence in mine. And that's because we have a lot of stuff that is hard to articulate things with, and then the fine art stuff we like to use more. So there's that. We did have the pressure to put in one piece in this gallery. So it was the Donald Rodney piece, which is in a box at the back. We had pressure to put that one in because it had been curated in a project that was consulted with a lot of people for a long time in Birmingham, lots of different groups. And it's a piece by Donald Rodney, late Donald Rodney, and it's called Pygmalion, and it's of it's like a laughing policeman box thing, and it's an animatronic sculpture that when you walk up to it, it comes alive, and it's Michael Jackson, and he's dancing, and he's got a roughly blacked up face on a white mask. And basically, he was collected because they wanted the people who collected it thought it was a really important conversation about skin lightening and colorism and the impact on the black community, and then Michael Jackson as an interesting point of conversation as a person, and then Donald Rodney as a very important artist for the region. The museum did not know how to display it, but needed to display it because it had been collected by this process. And so all the other objects that had been collected in this process were all in a large gallery, and it's basically like, these were collected by lots of people, woohoo, isn't this fun? And they didn't know how to mediate this one. So they asked if, for body image, it could be involved. So we were really open with the collaborators, and we told them that there's a push to have this piece in here, but if you don't want it in here, we will say someone else has to deal with it. And actually one of our collaborators really didn't want it in there because he didn't feel that we could mediate it enough, or that the museum was the right space to talk about the themes in this piece, because while it's irreverent, Donald Rodney was irreverent, but he was also a black man with a disability who was discussing a lot of this stuff about black masculinity and how it's affected by white supremacy. And our collaborator's argument was, the museum is not perceived as a black man. It is perceived as a white man framing this. So how do we mediate that? Which was a big challenge, and we put in the collaborator's message in his trail. So if you read his trail, he basically says that, I didn't think this should be here because I didn't think we could mediate it. And then we put an introduction to the artist, and we put an introduction to colorism before you kind of engage in it. So that was how we tried to kind of engage with that. So that was one of those ones where there was external pressure to put something in. But normally the ones that are repeated are because they have pictures. So the curators know exactly what they're looking for. There's a problem in museum documentation where a lot of things aren't photographed and there's not enough time to find them. So if it's photographed well and documented well, it'll be used a lot. So everything that was used in the past is now. One of my personal ambitions for decolonizing is to document things better and to fix the database. So everything was photographed and catalogued with the new information, so that when it's searched for, it's easier to be found. And I do that with everything I do now. I make sure that the database matches the robust knowledge we actually have, so it can be used again.
Okay.
Hey, thanks for that. That was really good. I was just wondering if these kind of buzzwords of decolonizing and queering obviously come up a lot, and as someone who's brown and queer, that's appreciated when even if it fails or flops or is totally inappropriate and mishandled. But I just wondered, I'm also like middle class and from London, and very comfortable in museum spaces, even if they were just like white Tudors and had nothing to do with me. I still feel like I can cross that threshold. So I just wondered what conversations you had around class, because I feel like that's a conversation that often gets left out of these, even though it's naturally part of these identities to some extent.
The class argument comes up a lot more than you would think, but it's not in the funding documents. And it's not dealt with very well, really, because, again, it's a bit nebulous. We haven't really decided what we mean when we say, what class you belong to. And again, this is the idea that when I came to England, everyone told me that the class system was over and that it didn't exist anymore, and that I didn't need to learn about it because, don't worry, that doesn't exist anymore. I was in a grammar school in Buckinghamshire, so it definitely did matter, and it definitely mattered there, and it just wasn't articulated. There's projects that have come up now called Museum of Muck, where working class museum workers are kind of coming together to create collaboration to make sure that class is put into there's a word I'm looking for. Intersectional discussions.
How could you forget that word?
It should be tattooed on my arm. That class is actually part of the intersectional question, a lot deeper, and not because quite a lot it's clumsily dealt with as if it aligns somehow with race, which is one of the things we had with the passes now as well. I had a problem with it because I felt that we created far too many binaries of kind of poor black and rich white to discuss pain. So I have another argument, another version of presenting that, where I talk about how we created a parallel singular narrative in a decolonial exhibition, because a lot of the richest people I know are not white, and that story needs to be fleshed out more and talk about the complexities of different relationships, and not necessarily in a celebratory way, but in a real way that talks about humans and how we actually act when there's opportunity involved, and whether or not somebody is going to have pain for our benefit, and how often that actually factors into whether or not we still go forward, basically.
Right. We have time for one more final question.
So the notion of artist, curator, artist and curator, artist/curator, the duality of this, maybe we don't have time to lash into the negatives. So what is the kind of positive? How does this intersection feeds itself in your case?
In my case, it is really interesting because my creative process has always involved making something, putting it in front of other people, and having them rip it apart, and me to then kind of respond to that criticism and either defend what I've done or change what I've done. So I treat museums in the same way. I assume that everything we're putting up is to be criticized, critiqued, pulled apart, improved, or defended. And that really helps me when I deal with stuff that other people consider controversial, risky, etc. That's the whole point, right? Creativity is about other people feeding in and responding. You know, we don't make it, death of the author, you know, the audience kind of change it. So yeah, for me it's been really useful because I get thrown into a lot of the less mundane, more interesting, trickier subject matter. And I like it. And I think artists like that. A lot of other disciplines don't like the difficult stuff and actually just want to do service to the research interest they have. So if it is kind of 17th century paintings and the things they know about the artist and the painting and the practice, they want to do service to that research and just present it so that it can be viewed by other people. Whereas I don't think that the viewer should be passive. I think that if I've done that work, the service is actually about someone else challenging that back.
Okay. Thank you. That's a good note to end on. So I think the tradition now calls for drinks upstairs.
Yeah.